Janet has been a gender-critical feminist activist for about 5 years. She helped start Speak Up for Women New Zealand and Women's Liberation Aotearoa. She is the New Zealand country contact for WDI. She is speaking as an individual in this webcast, as well as sharing some information as the New Zealand country contact for WDI. She will be speaking about New Zealand women's rights activism in the light of New Zealand's legislation, policy and practices over the last year.
Kia ora katoa, ko Janet tōku ingoa, kei te noho hao ke. So my name's Janet and I live in Auckland, which at the moment is a city of floods, actually. And I'm going to talk about some of the legislation and policy and how that's affecting us and over the last year or so, and how women are fighting back against it. Yeah, women's rights activism in 2022, looking forward to 2023. So this wasn't exactly 2022, but in December 2021, we had the Births, Deaths and Marriages Act was passed, which installed sex self-ID for the birth certificate. So that was a kind of a defeat for us who'd been fighting that. However, there is a clause in there which says that you don't have to go by the birth certificate to prove what somebody's sex is. So that's it here, and it's 79B, any other relevant information. So you don't, so that actually gives us that way out, that really nobody has to enforce, for example, a women's toilet or changing room or refuge. They don't have to include men who identify as women because they have a birth certificate. So that is something that we did win. And in response to that, one of the major organisations, which was Speak Up for Women, sort of changed their orientation away from just fighting that act to fighting for women's sex-based rights in general, with the slogan Sex Matters. And then the other piece of legislation was this Conversion Practice Prohibition Legislation Act, which of course bans any practice which they consider as aimed at changing someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. And of course for us, the gender identity is the problem, because that can really mean, if you're trying to protect someone's gender identity, you could be encouraging transing away the gay. But again, there's some parts in that legislation which give us a way out. Sorry, we're moving on. So this is number 5, where they define what a conversion practice is not, is it says that these things are not conversion. So any action a health practitioner takes when providing a health service, if they consider it's in their reasonable professional judgment is appropriate, complies with their legal, professional and ethical standards. So I think, some counsellors, especially who went to the CATA conference, think that means they won't get prosecuted if they don't practice the affirmation approach, but you do have to be registered to get that exclusion. However, there are others who also get excluded. Sorry, I'm losing my place here. Yeah, so other people who may not even be registered could still not be prosecuted, like parents or informal helpers. For example, if they're just providing acceptance, support or understanding, or if they're facilitating an individual's coping skills, and development or identity exploration. And that word exploration is a little bit broader, doesn't mean affirmation necessarily, giving social support or expressing a belief, So maybe this legislation will not lead to convictions, but I wouldn't be surprised if people try anyway with prosecutions, but that's what we will see, what will happen. Now, soon after that, the Child and Adolescent Therapists Association announced they were going to have a conference. Conference was due in August, and the CATA, who is what they're called for short, they do support an exploratory approach gender identity, not the affirmation approach. So a lot of people got very upset when they were announcing their conference, and there was a petition against it. A lot of professional bodies spoke out against them, and there were some protests. This is just a couple of examples. This was the Psychological Society, who say that being transgender is not a psychological illness or disorder. And so anyone who says it is, it must be transphobic. And then you've got the New Zealand Association of Counsellors, who are also complaining that CATA seems to pathologise transgender people and support conversion. And then they actually threaten that if you are a counsellor yourself and you don't report another member who's being too exploratory, you could get into trouble with your organisation, or, you know, so they're actually threatening not only people who don't do affirmation, but people who don't report on people as well. So that went ahead, that conference. It was very successful, and I think that some people at that conference were quite optimistic that the legislation norming gender identity, but I still think we need to wait and see, because they need to be tested, really. Another thing that happened in 2022 was that the Education Department put up updated relationships and sexuality guidelines. I put the first lot up in 2020, and they've sort of refreshed them and given more resources. And basically these are in favour of gender identity. And here are some of the definitions that they use. You can see here: bisexual, person who is emotionally and sexually attracted to more than one gender. They're always using the word gender. They have a definition. Have this, so they are on a continuum. Politically correct gender views go. This is their definition of sexual orientation. It's all about gender, person's sexual identity in relation to the gender or genders. So that's the problem with these relationships and sexuality guidelines. And this is what they said about puberty blockers. This is for older children. Understand how sex, gender and sexuality might change across the lifespan span. So that's pretty unscientific to say that sex could change across the lifespan span. And down below they're talking about normal things that might happen as you grow up, including using hormone blockers. That's one of the things they talk about a bit lower down there. So the resist gender education started up. I don't know exactly when. So that's a really great organisation of parents and teachers and feminists who are fighting those changes with those guidelines and what's going on in the schools as a consequence of them. Now, corrections are also changing their regulations, because now we have sex self-ID in the birth certificate. They can't really allow anybody with a birth certificate to go wherever they want, like a man with a birth certificate saying they're a female automatically going into a woman's prison. So they want to change it to give themselves more flexibility. However, the general policy has not been something that reassures me that they really care about women. For example, his name was, I've forgotten what his name was, I'll tell you in the next page. He claimed several names, but there they are: Richard Nelson, Emma Nelson, and Pandora Electra. And he stabbed 3 people in a restaurant, and that's a description of what he did to the female victim. The injuries to the female victim were severe. They included a laceration to the left side of her face and a stab wound to her upper back that punctured her right lung, causing it to collapse and blood to flow into her chest cavity. So this is, Emma Nelson supposedly, and his lawyer says, oh yes, transgender women needed to go to women's prison for safety and to do drug and alcohol rehabilitation. So, corrections isn't really showing that they care about women. But so we'll have to wait and see what happens when they change their regulations. And many groups and individuals made submissions to those regulations, including Speak Up for Women and Women's Liberation Aotearoa, and I helped do the ones from Women's Liberation. So there is a section in the Human Rights Act which allows for sex-specific accommodation, which should apply to prisons. And also there is, this is what the United Nations says in its rules for prisoners. There's the United Nations standard minimum rules for treatment of prisoners called the Nelson Mandela rules. And there's also the United Nations rules for the treatment of women prisoners, which show that women have to be treated, with regard to their safety. So really, I'm pretty sure New Zealand signed up to both of those, so they definitely should not be having any males in women's prisons. It's actually they're breaking those agreements that they've signed up to. Moving on. So here are some more things that have happened this year. There's the LGB Alliance. It was formed, and they have a website. Not a website. They have a Twitter page. This is their Twitter page, and they also have a public Facebook group as well as a private one. So that's lesbian, gay, and bisexual, making a point that that's not the same as being trans. Aggressive. And they met with police, as far as I understand, and the police are happy to receive advice from them. So that's looking promising, rather than just listening to advice from all the rainbow groups that have a very trans-orientated approach. Now, another thing that's been happening this year, things to do with councils. Now, actually, in 2021, a High Court judge ruled that the councils cannot prevent women from hiring things like libraries, talk about their sex-based rights, because Speak Up for Women's not a hate group. This is what a judge ruled. So a lot of councillors know that now. And we had elections for councillors this year, and there was a questionnaire sent to them by the Free Speech Union. And a lot of them recognise that, yes, women going for their sex-based rights do have a right to use council facilities. So that was good to know. But there's still been some problems with councils. And for example, some of the swimming pools, which are supposed to are not actually providing proper single-sex changing rooms for women. And Jennifer Scott complained about that to the Nelson Council, and the mayor got very upset about it. Dunedin Mayor slams concerns about transgender people at swimming pool as repugnant, and his name is Aaron Hawkins. Now, I'm pleased to say that he didn't get re-elected. So whether that was because of his little tantrum there or other reasons, I don't know, but he's gone. But I don't think that women's changing rooms in swimming pools are guaranteed to be safe at this point. Another thing that has happened this year is that the Midwifery Council announced that they are no longer going to use words mother and woman in their literature and in their scope of practice. Now, they're an administrative body, which is kind of part of the government to a degree, I think. Or they're, under the auspices of the government in some way or other. They have the power to determine people's conditions of employment and things. So that's what they've said, and they used quite a lot of vague terms in te reo in place of simple words, even Maori words like wahine and mama. And this is a complaint from Mana Wahine Kōrero. They wrote a letter. This is just the beginning of it. protesting the removal of these words, for wahine and mama, or mother, woman, etc. It's a really disgusting however, it's worthy of note that the College of Midwives doesn't really agree with it, and the College of Midwives is more like a union for midwives or a professional association. They wouldn't outright say they disagree with it, but they have said they will keep using these words like mother, wahine, and woman, and so on. So it's not, there's all the power doesn't just rest with the Midwifery Council there. Now, another thing that happened, there's been quite a lot of changes happening in the media this year, not huge changes, but sort of maybe subtle changes. Like we had a blackout for several years about anything to do with women's sex-based rights or any problems that might happen with transgenderism. And but this year it's slightly shifted, and part of that is because in England, there was the report from Hilary Cass to the UK government, which outlined the dangers of puberty blockers, and that saying that they're not proven to be safe or reversible. And there's been a little bit of a shift because of changes overseas like that. But nevertheless, the media is but some of the good things are Kathleen Stock was interviewed by Kim Hill on Radio New Zealand, and then later on the Ministry of Health actually changed its guidelines on its website and took away its advice that puberty blockers are safe and reversible. It removed it, but at the same time they're still claiming to journalists that they are safe and reversible, so it's a bit of a contradiction there. So there's been a few complaints to the Media Council, and they're starting to get a tiny bit of success. And I know that for a complaint she made in her talk. So this is one that I was involved with, a complaint, which was a report from News Hub about Jennifer Scott, who had a protest at the Ministry of Social Development office in Dunedin. She didn't like she was complaining about the posters there, which were recommending pronouns, and she was complaining about the harm that is done to children through puberty blockers, and she was trespassed. Now, just that whole, these words here are not my words. These are the words that were used by News Hub. So this is their heading, which already kind of belittles the woman in a way, just saying that she's getting upset. And then there were complaints because they said that Jennifer's views were typical of views of anti-transgender people, so dismissing them and smearing her, really, for being anti-trans. Complaints were made, and so News Hub knew that they'd gone too far, so they took away that statement about anti-transgender people. And so this is what they wrote at the top here. This story was amended on November 2nd to remove a reference to false arguments used by anti-transgender people. Well, that wasn't enough. They'd said a whole lot of bullshit in their report, actually. And the fact they'd removed that statement and then had this ridiculous statement at the top wasn't good enough. And so we all proceeded, there were several of us women proceeded to complain to the Media Council. And one of the complaints that I made was about this statement here in red. And I said that that statement could be read to mean that the reason they removed it was because anti-transgender people were making false statements. So it didn't really explain that they removed what they said because they themselves were biased. And actually the Media Council did agree with me about that. And this was a complaint about corrections, and they said that News Hub did not correct their article sufficiently. However, there were a lot of other complaints about their absolute bias and throughout the whole article, including their claim that puberty blockers were safe and effective. and reversible. So it was only a partial success. But I do think that, oops, we don't want to look at that. I do think that even a partial success is like a little crack in the door that the light comes in. The Media Council is noticing that the media has just been saying whatever it wants, and it's warning them they have to be a bit more careful. So I still put that as a victory, even though lots of the complaints didn't get upheld. At least one of them did. Now, just sort of looking briefly towards 2023, Lava's complaint was accepted in January by the Human Rights Review Tribunal, and Lava, this is Lesbian Action for Visibility Aotearoa, complained against the Pride, Wellington Pride Incorporated, because they refused to let Lava have a stand, table, information table at a Pride event in 2021. So that's been accepted to be looked at. So that's progressing. This year we've got Kelly J. Keen's visit coming up, and a lot of women are getting pretty energized by that. So that will be happening in March. I think we do need to watch out for proposals to add gender to the Human Rights Act and to add it to human hate speech legislation. There's the Law Commission is looking into those things. So we just need to watch out that they might try to do that. Of course, the Women's Declaration International is against adding gender to any legislation. Statistics New Zealand are likely to make gender the default rather than sex in their statistics. There might be some surrogacy legislation looked at this year. Tamati Coffee certainly wants to get it in so that people using surrogates have more rights than the birthing mothers do to claim to be the parents. So he doesn't want them to have to go through the hassle of adopting this child that they're getting from the woman that they're using. So that's another thing to watch out for. We need to watch out and see what happens when the Birth, Deaths and Marriages Act comes into action, which it will be doing this year, and what happens in the prisons with the new regulations. Watch out for any court cases that might happen through the conversion practices legislation. And of course, there's a general election coming up. And now that Jacinda Ardern has gone, that might change the landscape. Hard to know. There's no party in Parliament right now that supports women's sex-based rights. There is a new group putting up candidates so far called Workers Now, and they also support women's sex-based rights. So that might have some promise. And Women's Declaration New Zealand hopefully will put out a questionnaire to political candidates this year, similar to the one that the Australian women did in Women's Declaration, International Women did when they had just before their general election. So I'm hoping that we'll get one out to go around all the electoral candidates this year. So now I'm just going to this is a little summary, it's certainly not all of them, but here are some of the gender critical groups in New Zealand. Oops, we'll go back to there. So Speak Up for Women, Women's Liberation Aotearoa, Mana Wahine Kōrero, then there's Lava, Save Women's Sports Australasia, Resist Gender Education, LGB Alliance Aotearoa, some of the feminist older women lobbyists, Lesbian Rights Aotearoa, Women's Dignity, Fully Informed New Zealand, Women's Declaration International New Zealand. That's just some of them. And this is some links which I'll put into the chat. Like if you want to see a fuller report, I did send one to the website. So you can have a look at that on the website where you click onto New Zealand on the website. And you'll see the fuller report there for what happened over 2022. If you want to contact and want to help Women's Declaration International this year with any projects that we do, for example, the asking of the MPs, or maybe what their views are, or sending letters to them, sending submissions, that's just give an email to nz@womensdeclaration.org, and there's a Facebook page to have a look at. So thank you very much, everyone, and ngā mihi.